All right. Good evening, everybody, or I guess I should say good night if you're watching this live. I'm recording this um, Tuesday, April 7th, about 9 p.m. So you'll get this posted right away. Most of you probably won't watch it until tomorrow, and that's okay. We've done this routine once before. We'll do it as long as we have this period of e-learning. We're going to be going through the Unit 5 PowerPoint entitled The Executive Branch, okay? Before we begin, I want to just pull up a couple things for you. First, let's go over what's due for this unit. So let me pull up to the government schedule. I posted yesterday the executive branch PowerPoint, the vocabulary terms, and the objective questions. Today is the 7th. I'm recording a lecture that you'll have access to as soon as it's completed, or if you're watching live. And then next week, on the 14th, so a week from today, I will post a quiz. That's the same day your vocab and objectives are also due. If you are absent for the first quiz, I'm also going to reopen the quiz on that day for you to make up so you can get a grade for it. The quiz will be open for 6 days. It's going to close, or 7 days actually. It's going to close Tuesday night, the 21st. So you have an entire week to work on this to get it done, to answer the quiz, though the objectives are due the first day I open the quiz, which is a week from today. All right, so after today, you have all the information you need to complete this assignment, to complete this, the quiz, the vocab, and objective questions, okay? So let me just show you what's on the vocab and objective. Here is the vocab terms right here. Every single one of these will be covered on our PowerPoint on the lecture. And here are the 5 questions we're going to be talking about. We also are probably going to have a couple resources and things I'll post that will help round out some of these questions or help further describe some of these terms, okay? All right. So without wasting any more time, let's go ahead and get into the PowerPoint. Now, this PowerPoint is what it would have looked like if we had met in person in class, as opposed to what we're doing now. So there'll be some slides that I'll skip and I'll say don't worry about them. There'll be some slides that might make a lot of sense, might not make a lot of sense, but I'll explain them to you. So that's why it's important to watch these videos. They kind of help flesh out some of the information. By no means required, but definitely make understanding the PowerPoint a lot easier, okay? And this PowerPoint will be posted on Edsby for you to access. Okay, so this unit is all about the executive branch, which is basically the president and his cabinet. Okay, so we're skipping that slide. Normally, we would, just as we've done every unit since we started this course, go to the Constitution and go to Article 2 of the Constitution and answer these questions. I'm actually going to post this slide on Edsby, and you can Google U.S. Constitution, Article 2, and answer these questions. It's not going to be for a grade, but I promise you, if you took the last test, you should know this. The questions on the test are going to be pretty similar to some of these questions. So this will just help flesh out a lot of that information. So not going to be a grade, but I'm going to post this slide on Edsby, and I'll have the document you'll use is Article 2 of the Constitution. So it's going to ask you things like who has executive power, who chooses the president, what are the qualifications for president. We'll talk about all those to the slide, and I'll go back here a little bit later and talk about it some more. Okay. All right, the president has several roles, several jobs that he tries to fulfill as the leader of the executive branch. So I just want to point out something. If we look at the vocab here, all these terms right here and these 3 right here are all the next few slides, and I'm going to talk about each one by one. Okay. These are all different titles or different jobs the president has. So number 1 is going to be the chief of state. The president's often called the chief of state, state with a capital S, because he is symbolically and ceremonially the head of our country. He's considered the most powerful person in our governments. And he is the one who goes when there's meetings of different countries. He's usually the one that goes to other nations and talks about what our country is doing. He's the one in times of crisis giving speeches. He's the one that kind of speaks on behalf of the nation. So though we have three distinct branches and a separation of powers, the president is kind of the face of our government. So he's the one that represents us most in terms of representing us to the rest of the world. So that's the chief of state. The chief of executive. The Constitution, Article 2, says the direct quote is, the president shall have executive power. Okay, so he's the one that actually enforces the law. He's the one that actually has the ability to make sure laws are executed and enforced in the way that he or she sees fit. And that is why he's often called the chief executive. Chief administrator. Okay, a way I think about this is we have administrators at our school. We have several APs. We got Mr. Derflinger. He's the administrator in charge of athletics, the athletic director. We got Gearhart. He's one of the guys you'll go to if you get in trouble. We have Miss Savino. She's one that deals with port cards and scheduling and testing and things like that. But above all of them is Miss King, our principal. So she actually is in charge, and she has other people below her that she delegates responsibility to that make up the administration at our school. We call them administrators. The chief administrator would be Miss King. In the federal government, in our executive branch, the president doesn't do everything by himself. He has a cabinet. He has multiple agencies and organizations that have leaders at the top that answer to the president. But the chief of all those is the president. So he's known as the chief administrator. He directs the entire executive branch, and he's in charge of all the members that make up the various administrative roles. So you got the FBI, you got the CIA, you got the EPA, you have his cabinet, the Department of Defense, NASA, any kind of government agency at the top has someone in charge of that. But the president's the guy in charge of all those people. So he's considered the chief administrator. So he kind of divvies out different roles because obviously one person can't do all the jobs, right? All right, the chief diplomat. Diplomat refers to somebody who interacts on the behalf of one country with another country and is basically the spokesperson for our country to other leaders. The president, we see this all the time. He'll go on tours of other countries. He'll meet with the president of China. He'll meet with the president of France, Germany, wherever, and he'll hobnob and talk and speak to him. And basically, he's representing our country to these other countries, and he's in charge of foreign policy. So if we want to declare war on somebody, if we want to stop trade, if we want to deal with immigration policy, that's his prerogative as the person in charge of how we interact with other nations. Chief diplomat. Commander-in-Chief. This is the most famous probably title of the president because it's word for word taken out of the Constitution. It says he is the commander-in-chief of the nation's military. So he's in charge, Treasury Board, commander-in-chief of our military. This is where people get confused. I hope you remember this from last unit. The president does not have the power to declare war. That comes exclusively from the legislative branch. But because of the clause commander-in-chief in the Constitution, and because he's the one actually in charge of the military, the president can often take what's called executive actions, and he can order a drone strike to take out a terrorist. He can order troops to go to a certain place to engage in a military action that is in the best interest of protecting our country if he thinks that's the case. People would argue, is that basically declaring war? Technically, no, not in name, but functionally it kind of is, right? So this is why a lot of people get confused and say, hey, can the president declare war? I thought he's the one that sends the troops. Well, that's true. He is. So that's why often the president is considered the commander-in-chief. Famously, Obama, SEAL Team 6 knew they had a target to kill Osama bin Laden, famous terrorist, one of the guys behind 9/11. He didn't have to get congressional approval to go take out somebody. He said, yep, go get him. SEAL Team 6 went in, took him out, right? If we think there's a high priority target and we can hit him with the drone, the president says, yep, go get him, can take him out. Commander-in-chief. All right, the chief legislator. This one's kind of funny because you think the president doesn't have legislative powers. The president can't pass laws. The president doesn't write the law. That's the legislative branch. But in a weird way, the president actually has a lot of power over the legislative branch. First of all, typically, the president, when he's elected, is the one who sets the legislative agenda. So they'll give a big speech and they'll say, here's what we're going to accomplish this year, and Congress is going to help me accomplish that. So Trump really tried to push tax cuts. President Obama famously really tried to push Obamacare, right? So he set the agenda. He's not the one making the law. He's not writing it. He's not the one arguing with Congress members in the halls of the congressional building. But he set the agenda. Now, again, he doesn't have legislative power, but he can suggest, here's what we're going to do. Here's the laws we're going to pass. And he has the power of the veto, which is really big. If he doesn't like the direction a law is being drafted and says, I don't like this, he can threaten his legislators, hey, if this law gets passed, I'm vetoing it. So don't even waste your time. You better make a law that I like, right? So he has a lot of power over the legislative branch, even though he's not somebody directly writing the laws themselves. Okay, so that's why he's often called the chief legislator. Chief economist, our current president, President Trump loves this role, I think. He's always tweeting about the stock market, maybe not so much now that it's not doing so hot, but when it was doing really well, he was, tweeting about how it's doing great, how the Dow's up, how businesses are, doing best business they've ever done, all that kind of stuff. And that's because the president is expected to keep a close eye on the economy. And if something really bad happens, he's expected to take action. And the best example is happening right now. Coronavirus crisis gets, at the worst it's gotten for our country, and people are losing jobs. The airlines are, down, they can't fly. Carnival cruises, cruise lines can't travel. Tourism stops, businesses are shut down. Everyone's hurting economically, and I really hope, if you're affected, I'm sorry, and I hope we can get through this time. But we look to the president. We say, hey, what's your plan? What are you going to do? And lo and behold, the president, along with Congress, got together and they came out with what they called a stimulus package. They passed a bill where they're giving money, and it's going to end up being trillions of dollars to businesses, to people who are struggling, to people who qualify, and you're going to get money in your bank account if you're one of these people or one of these businesses or one of these corporations, right? So that's him being the chief economist. Now, people might not agree with the action he takes, but if it's enough or who it's helping, but that's his role, right? Heavily involved in the economy. Chief economist. All right. Chief of party. We have a two-party system in this country, and if you are whatever party wins, if you're of that party, you're now basically in charge of the party. So the Republicans win the presidency. All Republicans are basically going to go in lockstep with what the president says. So he basically sets the agenda and platform of the party, and he's the most visible spokesperson for the party. So when he starts talking about stuff, if you're a Republican, anything a reporter asks you is going to be, hey, can you respond what the president said about this? So you better be on the same page as the president if you want to be welcome in the party. Okay, and I believe, yep, this is the last one, chief citizen. This is more like a symbolic role. The president has to be a natural born citizen, one of the requirements to be president. The president is seen as one of the people, right? Now, to be honest, we know he's not really any president is not anything like the average person. Typically, they typically come from wealthy families, a place of privilege. They're well educated or have business experience or something that kind of gave them a leg up or whatever. But they are still a citizen of the U.S., just like you and me. In theory, they're supposed to kind of represent what all people want and try to represent the best interest of the people, right? So sometimes they're called the chief citizen. Okay, just want to go back to this to show you. First, let me double check the lecture's still going. All right, we're at 14 minutes in. So just to clarify again, literally all the way down this column and these first three here we just talked about. Pretty straightforward, pretty easy. If you look at the objective questions, what roles do the presidents have serving in their position? Boom, just answered it. Pretty easy. Okay, let's continue on. All right, let's talk about amendments relating to the president. There are three specific laws and amendments we need to know that deal with the president. Promise you they'll be on the test. They're also both vocab terms. The 22nd Amendment. The 22nd Amendment limits the number of terms the president can serve to 2. So a total of 8 years for 2 4-year terms, the maximum amount of terms they can serve. They don't have to be consecutive. We've actually had one president who won a term, then came back after being not in office for 4 years and got his second term 4 years later. The Presidential Succession Act actually sets in order the 18 positions after the president if something were to happen if he were to be removed from office, whether he was impeached or killed or died or resigned. And then we're going to talk about that more in a minute. And the 25th Amendment gives the vice president the authority to take on the role of president if they are unable to perform their duties. So not just if the president dies or is removed. Let's say the president, this has actually happened a few times in our history. Let's say the president gets injured or is really sick or has to go under some kind of surgery. And let's say while he's under surgery, something happens. You can't go to the president. He is unable to perform his duties. He's knocked out. He's having surgery performed. He's unconscious, whatever. The vice president is actually given that role. So we've had instances of Ronald Reagan famously was shot and he survived, but while he was shot, he was in the hospital, unable to do the typical daily tasks of the president. So the vice president for that time period until Reagan recovered was in charge of the executive branch for that period of time. And once the president's back to health, then the vice president relinquishes power back to the president. Now, that also means if the president were to be removed or die, the vice president is next in line when we talk about presidential succession. So we need to know those two amendments in law that deals with the president specifically. Okay, here is the line of presidential succession. So if succession means coming after, so if the president were to die or get impeached or resign or for whatever reason is no longer in office, he's gone, and he still has, let's say, 2 years left on his term, this is the order of who would take over if that person was to be removed. Okay. Now here's what gets confusing. Let's just use our current president. Let's say, we hope this doesn't happen. Let's say President Trump were to die, and he still has a year left in his term. The vice president, Mike Pence, would become president for the rest of this term. And then after his term was up, maybe Mike Pence would run for president, or maybe he'd resign and the Republicans would pick a new candidate. Who knows what would happen. Now, here's where we don't want to get confused. The Speaker of the House right now is Nancy Pelosi, would not, let me emphasize this, would not become vice president. The Speaker of the House would still remain Speaker of the House. So you don't shift up the chain here. The new president, Mike Pence, who was vice president, he would get the ability to appoint a new vice president. Okay. Now, let's say, again, let's pray this never happens, that the president and the vice president are driving on a motorcade to a speaking event, and both of them are killed. So now there's no vice president. So next in line is the Speaker of the House. So the Speaker of the House goes all the way up to president. Now, as president, the new Speaker of the House, the new president, Nancy Pelosi, would be the president. She would get to name a vice president, and the president pro tempore of the Senate would not move up to Speaker of the House. The House of Representatives would pick a new Speaker of the House. Okay. So let's think about that for a minute. Again, not to confuse, you don't move up the chain. So let's say something really crazy happened and all the way down to the Secretary of Agriculture died in a bomb or something. The Secretary of Commerce would become the new president. That does not mean the Secretary of Labor would go all the way up to vice president, or the Secretary of Health and Human Services would not go all the way up to Secretary of State, or whatever the case may be. The new president, the Secretary of Commerce, will get to appoint all the empty positions from the executive branch. So he'd appoint a new Secretary of State, a new Secretary of Treasury, a new Secretary of Defense, and so on. The legislative branch would pick a new Speaker of the House and a new President pro tempore. Okay, does that make sense? Usually this is where you'd say yeah, but you're not here to say yeah. Okay. Now, I want you to notice something. The Vice President, the Speaker of the House, and the President pro tempore of the Senate all actually technically come from the legislative branch. The Vice President, remember, the Vice President is actually They're part of the executive branch, but they're also in charge of the Senate. They're called the President of the Senate. The Speaker of the House is the person who presides over the House of Representatives, and the President pro tempore of the Senate is kind of like the backup Vice President. They preside over the Senate when the Vice President's doing other stuff. So the first position that comes from this line of succession that is part of the executive branch exclusively is Secretary of State down. These people, Secretary of State, all the way down to Homeland Security, so 15, all come from the president's cabinet. Okay, the cabinet is the president's closest advisors, the people who the president handpicks, and the people who give the president advice on very specific issues. Okay, so it wouldn't make much sense for the Secretary of Education to all of a sudden become Secretary of Agriculture. They have no experience or knowledge about agriculture. They were appointed specifically because of their educational knowledge, right? So that's why you don't just move up the chain. If something crazy were to happen and all these people were to die, the Secretary of Energy, if they survived, if they don't become president, they're still Secretary of Energy. They don't move up the chain or change their position. Okay, I hope that makes sense. I hope I explained that clearly. There 100% will be some questions on the test and be some of it objective and vocab questions as well. Okay. Let's talk about powers of the president. What can the president actually do? Compared to Article 1, there's a lot less expressed powers of the president. Okay. Here are, let's see if they'll pop up. Let's go back. Sorry. Here are, we'll go in a second, but here are some examples that we'll talk about in a minute. But really, what I want to emphasize here is most of the powers we have of the president are what we call implied powers, meaning they're not directly stated word for word. They're not obvious. They're things that you have to kind of make an inference or an understanding on your own. Okay, so Article 2, Section 2 has some of the express powers, and really the only ones are Commander-in-Chief of the military, and it says the president has executive power. Not much else. The other thing it talks about is the power to appoint officers. So they can appoint judges, they can appoint their cabinet officials. And then the last one is they have the power to pardon people of crime. So not a lot mentioned. Most of the implied powers are mentioned in Article 2, Section 1, and the biggest one is executive orders. They are directives that have the effect of law, but there's no explanation of what they can and cannot issue as an executive order. All it says in Article 2, Section 1, the president shall have executive power. Very vague. It doesn't say what that means. It doesn't say how they can use that power. It doesn't say what they can use that power for. So this is where the president can say, hey, you know what? I think we need to have military intervention in this area in the Middle East where there's terrorists. So I'm going to send a drone strike. There's nowhere in the Constitution that talks about the president being able to do that, but he's going to say, I have executive power. I'm commander-in-chief. I'm doing it. Here's where the president can issue an executive order where he's going to say, we can issue a partial travel ban on people from certain countries. He's going to say, I have the power to enforce the law, and I believe these people are, for whatever reason, from different countries. Something's going on, could be dangerous. I'm going to ban them from coming in. That's an executive order. One side is going to say, you don't have that power, you don't have that authority. That's not fair. The president's side is going to say, no, I have executive power. I can enforce the law, and we have laws about who can and cannot come to this country. I can issue an executive order preventing certain groups or certain people from certain countries from entering in if I think that's appropriate. Okay. All right. We would have done something with this if we were in class. We're not going to worry about it. We're going to skip that. We're going to skip that. Okay, let's talk about the election process. So we would have talked a whole bunch about this had we been in class. We're just going to go through the PowerPoint slides, and that's going to be it for you. So how does someone become president? This is pretty obvious, but the Constitution does not actually mention how the president is actually picked. So right now we're going through this process. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says you have a primary. There's nowhere in the Constitution that says You have every state vote, and you start with 8 candidates, and you go to 4 and 3 and 2 and 1. There's nothing about that. The Congress and political parties over history and time have basically created a process that now essentially is the rule, is the law. But there was nothing written in the Constitution about that. But now that as time has gone on, it's become uh, the process. So we're going to go through the steps. Step one is the big one, probably the most underrated and important step. If you can't get off the ground with this one, you're not going to have a good chance of becoming a candidate for president. First is fundraising. So this can happen literally up to 4 years before the next election. So there were people raising money in 2016, almost immediately after President Trump won, to run for president in 2020 on the Democratic side. Most people wait till about a year and a half to maybe a year out. So you had a lot of people in January and February and March of last year, 2019, kind of putting their name in the hat. They create committees, they kind of poll people, and they try to see, hey, am I popular? Am I well liked? They begin with websites where they ask for donations. And here's why fundraising is so important. You need money to have the staff to do research. You need money to go all over the country telling everybody all about um, your platform, your beliefs, why you think you're a good candidate. You need money to pay for ads. You need money to pay for a website, for clothes, merch that has your name, campaign posters, all that stuff. And it costs millions and millions and millions of dollars. So if you can't raise money, it doesn't matter how good your ideas are, you're going to kind of peter out, right? So you kind of got to get this going early. This is why wealthier business people or people that have wealth through their books or things they've done typically get a good head start because they can already have some resources. So famously, Trump, he bragged about he didn't need a lot of donations because he self-funded a lot of his campaign. You may have heard about Michael Bloomberg earlier in the year. He was a guy that was up there running for president. He was the mayor of New York, super wealthy tech guy. Before that, um, he didn't have to use any of his fund, take any donations. He used a lot of his own funds. He's a billionaire. You probably, if you were on YouTube a lot or watched TV at all during the last 2 months, you probably saw a lot of his ads. He had ads on during the Super Bowl even. We know how expensive those are, right? So um, fundraising is a big deal. Now, it only gets you so far. Obviously, a lot of you haven't heard of Michael Bloomberg because he had to drop out and didn't get a lot of votes. So it only gets you so far, but that's a big help. All right, step two. This is the stage we're in right now in 2020, the primaries and the caucuses. If we didn't have this whole coronavirus thing going on, this would be the number one news story you'd hear all the time if you were to go on Twitter, go on social media, turn on the news. This is all people be talking about. Okay. Every spring and summer before the general election, every single state has a primary election where people of that party vote for their preferred candidate and their votes assign delegates. So this happened over spring break. A lot of you probably didn't know about it or totally forgot because you were on spring break, and couple that with the coronavirus, not a lot of people were going out. But over spring break, Florida had their primary, and you go to the polls just like you would on election day. And the only difference is if you were in a closed state, which means only people of the same party could vote. If you were in a closed state, when you look at your ballot and you're a registered Democrat, you would only see Democrats. If you're a Republican and you looked on a Republican ballot, you would only see Republicans. So you won't see every candidate's name. You'd only see the one from the party you're registered with. If you're in an open state, you would actually have a list of both, and you would pick one Republican and one Democrat nominee. Okay, most states are a closed state. Florida is a closed state. If you're a registered independent, you actually can't vote in primaries that involve the Democrat and Republicans because you're not registered for either party. Okay. So here's what happens. When you vote, they tally up the votes. I'm going to go to a website and show you a link of one in a second of what it looks like. But basically, let's say right now we're down basically to Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders. Let's say Joe Biden won 55% of the vote and Bernie Sanders won 45%. In a winner-take-all state, Joe Biden would win every single delegate. Okay, so if a state had 100 delegates, he'd get 100 delegates. a lot of states are proportional. Proportional states split the delegates amongst candidates based on the percentage voted. So if it was 45-55, Joe Biden would receive 55 delegates and Bernie Sanders would receive 45 delegates. After all the primaries and caucuses are over, if whatever candidate gets there's a threshold you have to reach. Whatever candidate gets that threshold of delegates, they become the nominee for that party. Now, that's for the Democratic side right now. For the Republicans, because they control the presidency, Donald Trump is going to run for re-election. He doesn't have to worry too much about the primaries. States still hold a primary, but typically it's just formality. He doesn't have to worry about campaigning and doing debates and talking about getting enough delegates. Very few people vote, and the people who do vote, Trump's probably one of the few people on the list. He's going to get enough delegates. He becomes the nominee. Okay, but if we were in a year where both candidates, this actually happened in 2016, Obama was done with his 2 terms, so both parties had new candidates. You had this going on simultaneously on the Republican and Democratic side. There is something called a caucus, and if you have paid a little bit of attention in February, the Iowa caucuses are usually the very first place that votes for a candidate. And instead of actually voting on a ballot and just counting up the ballot, in a caucus, people actually get to debate and talk, and you walk around the room, and then you stand in a certain section, and they count who is voting for who, and then you can actually move and change your mind and vote for somebody different. There was a lot of controversy this year, and my prediction to you can take it to the bank, in 2024, when we have the next series of primaries, caucuses will not exist. There was a lot of controversy this year. They used an app that had a hard time tracking who voted for who, and different candidates claimed they won when really no one knows who won. They were so close. It was like split basically 2 or 3 ways. And it was kind of a chaotic, really embarrassing situation for the state of Iowa. So I'm almost going to guarantee you there's only a few states that still do them. It doesn't work logistically nowadays, especially in big states where you have millions of people who might vote. Caucuses are probably done. They're probably not going to happen anymore after 2020. So it's still a thing we want to know, but by the time I'm teaching this class in 4 years from now in 2024, and I'm an old man married with kids, I'm not even going to talk about caucuses because they don't exist, right? So just thought predict that for you. Oh, you can take it to the bank. When you hear about it, you can say Mr. L told you first. All right. These 2 videos are pretty interesting. I'm going to post them on YouTube. They talk about the caucuses and the primaries and how they work. This is the period, by the way, if you remember the 2016 election, some of you might. I know a lot of you were in middle school. But in the 2016 election, there was like 12 Republican candidates, and it dwindled all the way down. This is where they start dwindling people down. If you remember, if you pay attention early this year or late last year, I want to say there was like 8 to 10 Democratic candidates. You had guys like Andrew Yang, Kamala Harris, Cory Booker, Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Michael Bloomberg, Pete Buttigieg. You had that's the only ones I can remember off the top of my head. I know there was a few more. Some of them weren't as popular as others. Tom Steyer. There was another lady. Can't remember her name. She was from Minnesota. That doesn't matter. See, I don't even know them all, right? And I teach this stuff. So it dwindles down pretty fast to 2 or 3 candidates based on, usually after Iowa and a couple other states, somebody realizes, oh man, I'm getting last place in all these elections. I'm out. Or going back to fundraising, they don't have enough money to keep going. And then once you're losing votes, you're really not going to be able to raise a lot of money. You're going to realize, oh, people aren't going to want to give you money. Then you're not going to win. Third step, I'm going to post these videos on YouTube. Not required to watch them, but I think from YouTube on Edsby, I think they'll explain some of this a little bit better than even I can, right? All right, I want to actually pull up this link just to give you an idea of what the votes look like during the primaries. So this is from 2016, but you'll get the idea. It's a completed one. So here's what happened. We'll look at the current president, Donald Trump, and we'll look at how many delegates he needed to win. So to become the nominee, he had to get 1,237 delegates by the end of all the primaries. He clearly did. 1,400 delegates, dominated in the primaries. In the Democratic side, there was only 2 candidates in 2016, and by the way, Bernie tried again, and he's going to probably get second again. And of course, Hillary Clinton won the nomination. Uni 2383, she did not get the threshold. There's something called super delegates. Don't worry about learning about them because the rules actually changed after 2016 and what super delegates can do. Okay, just know with the super delegates, she did get the 2,300 mark. She got way over. She got 2,700. Okay, so here's what happened. We'll go state by state. In Iowa, we're going to look at the Republican side just for just show how it can dwindle down from 4 to 2 to 1. There's actually way more than 4, but only a few got votes. In Iowa, in February of 2016, it was a proportional system. So you can see here, Trump got 7 delegates. Ted Cruz got 8. Marco Rubio, he's the senator from our state, Florida, got 7. John Kasich got 1. New Hampshire, Donald Trump won with 11. He won. It was proportional, so he won 11 delegates. Kasich got 4. Rubio got 1. Cruz got 3. Right, and then we keep going. Here's an example of a winner take all. President Trump won the popular vote. It's winner take all, so he got all 50 delegates. Right. Let's scroll down to Florida. We'll get there eventually. Florida is a winner take all. There are 99 delegates. Trump won the majority, so he got all 99 delegates, right? But then you can see in some states, Missouri, he only got 37. Rubio got 15. Illinois, 54, 9, and 6. North Carolina was pretty close, evenly spread out, right? In Ohio, he actually didn't win winner take all state. John Kasich won. And you may be wondering, how in the world could a guy named John Kasich win? Well, he was the governor of Ohio, and he was relatively popular. So people in Ohio are like, oh, yeah, I like that guy. I'll vote for him. And it goes on from there. You add up all the votes, and that's how you get the total delegates, 1,500, which is what he needed 1,200 to win, right? So that same process is going on right now. I don't have an updated map. Just know on the Republican side, it's not happening. And on the Democratic side, Bernie Sanders is going up against former Vice President Joe Biden, and Joe Biden is pretty much pulling away with it at this point. He's going to get the total delegates needed to win. So that's how it dwindles down. Okay. These delegates, again, I'm going to see something. If I click latest results, let's see if it takes us to 2018 or 2020. Looks like it takes us to something else. So let's forget about it. Okay. All right. So once you've gotten the number of delegates, you have what's called the National Convention. This is held the summer before the general election. So this is going to happen. Well, with coronavirus, things might change, but it was supposed to happen sometime in July or August. It's right up before the general election occurs. This is all kind of basically it's a big hype fest, right? It's like, let's get people excited about our candidates. So it's almost like a mini concert. You have celebrities come out and give speeches. You have other politicians who are popular kind of endorse and say, oh yeah, we love this guy. We wanted him the whole time. And you have this is where you kind of come up with your ideas of what you're going to do to try to win the general election. And all those delegates officially meet together and officially and formally cast their vote for that person to be the nominee. Now, there's no surprise. You're not wondering, oh, who are they going to pick? You already know because you've gone through all 50 states and had the primaries. So there's no like, back in the day in the 1800s, this is actually when they debated who are we going to pick for president. They didn't have primaries. But now that we have the primary system, you already know who's going to be the candidate. It concludes with the president himself or the presidential nominee himself coming out and giving a huge speech, everyone getting amped and basically saying, here's how we're going to win the election. Here's how we're going to defeat Donald Trump is what the Democrats are going to say. Here's all the things we're going to do that's better than what Trump wants to do and get everybody excited. And it's a gear up for the national election. Okay. That's the next step. We call it the general election. It's always in The election itself is always in November, but it really begins in the fall from it square off. So we'll have probably Joe Biden squaring off, arguing with Donald Trump. Be super awkward as they always are. And this is where they're trying to appeal to everybody. So in the primaries, you're really only worried about your party. So if you're a Democrat, you're only talking to Democrat voters. If you're a Republican in a primary, you're only talking to Republican voters. And typically in the primaries, the Republicans act way more conservative than they really are, and the Democrats act way more liberal than they really are because they're trying to get the more extreme voters in the fringes of the party to vote for their candidate. In the general election, it goes the opposite way. They both kind of skew towards the middle. So the Republican candidate will say, "Oh no, I'm not really that conservative. I like these liberal ideas or somewhat liberal ideas. I'm in the middle." A liberal candidate, a Democrat candidate will say, I'm not that liberal. I like some of these kind of conservative ideas. I'm not as bad as the Republican over here, but I'm in the middle, right? I have some of these um, similar, I'm trying to reach the middle voters, the undecided voters, the people who might vote for either party or are kind of like unsure of what they believe. So this is where they kind of flesh out and debate, what they're um, gearing up. This is when you see a lot of ads, people really asking for money, asking for donations, selling shirts, have a website, whatever they can do, trying to get the general population to vote for them, not just their party. Concludes on election day. Now, that first bullet point, I want you to say it out loud, slowly, and think about it right now. Okay, so I'll pause. You do it. Good. Like Blue's Clues. Okay. Or Dora the Explorer or something. All right. The Tuesday after the first Monday in November. So you might say, wait, isn't that just the second? Why is that not just the first Tuesday? If Tuesday falls on November 1st, it's not going to be the first Tuesday. It's going to be the Tuesday after the first Monday. So that means it will be the next Tuesday. So the election can never be on November 1st. It can be on November 2nd. If Monday is November 2nd, right, or November 1st, the first Tuesday after the first Monday in November would be November 2nd. That works. But it cannot fall on November 1st. Okay. It dates back to old time logic, 1800s, 1700 logic. The first of the month was typically when people would be going to the bank to deposit checks or to take out money or do business because they're just getting paid or getting whatever the new month. And didn't want people to have to decide, oh, do I get paid and deposit my check and get ready for my business and my job, my income, or do I vote? Nowadays, with everything being direct deposit, digital, and all that stuff, it's not a thing anymore. But we just kept the tradition alive and we kept the pattern. We haven't changed that. Okay. Some people argue that's why we don't have a good voter turnout. It's in the middle of the week on a weekday when people are working, and it's not the same exact date every time. It kind of shifts around and people get confused, right? So some people argue, hey, if we just had election day on a Saturday, or if we had, a holiday that we voted on or something, it'd probably be easier. I kind of agree, but America likes to keep its traditions that we have, so it hasn't changed. That being said, you are able to vote early. A lot of polling places open up a week, maybe even earlier, and you can go in, and typically there's no line, and you can vote. You can also do what's called an absentee ballot. If you're a college kid, this is going to apply to some of you seniors. You'll be in college this November, right? You're going to be off at FSU or UCF or maybe even farther away, right? Maybe out in California or New York or something. You might be registered to vote in Florida, in Lutz. Obviously, you're not going to fly or drive down a random Tuesday in the middle of the week to vote on you're still in school. You can do what's called absentee voting. You can actually get your ballot mailed to you wherever you are. You fill it out, you mail it back, and as long as you mail it back by a certain date, it's going to count, right? So there's other ways to vote. You don't have to go in on that day, but most people like to go on the day. It's a day you remember. You set aside time. The polls usually open till 7, 8 o'clock at night, so you can go after work, and they open up early. Maybe on the way to work you can go. I will say that in our neck of the woods where we live, the lines aren't too bad. I've typically been able to go right after work. Of course, I'm a teacher. I get off a little bit earlier, so I'm going in at like 4, maybe 5 o'clock. And I've never had to wait in a huge line. Just kind of depends where you live and where your precinct is. Everybody votes, the entire population, and you're voting for at a precinct. It's a designated area near where you live. Typically, it's in somewhat of a walking distance from where you live. If you live in off Lutz Lake Fern, in the Lutz area, that Masonic Lodge right on Lutz Lake Fern, I believe, is one of the polling places right on the way to school, right? So pretty close. You can drive there literally in less than 2 to 3 minutes. Typically, they try to have them all very close to where people live. You go in, you have a ballot. It's going to have all types of things. Conception, I think y'all know this, but a lot of people maybe younger than you and people who aren't paying attention get confused. I think we know this now because the last election illustrated this. So, for example, our last election for president, 2016, President Trump lost by 3 million votes, but he won the electoral vote. That's the rule. That's the law. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't anything sketchy or weird. That's the law. It's happened on the first time, by the way. It's happened a couple other times in history. So he won. We'll talk about in a second why that is. And there's legitimate gripes with the system. And I would not be surprised if in my lifetime, it changes. I don't think it will change obviously not this election, probably not by 2024 either, but maybe the next election, maybe another decade. I could see it happening. People were kind of mad when someone loses by that much and still wins, but that's the law. That's the way it's in place today. So again, I want to emphasize the Electoral College picks the president, not the popular vote, not the person who gets the most votes. Okay. And again, your gut reaction might be like, that makes no sense. And I understand that. But we'll explain the logic behind it. Again, there's arguments for both sides, so I'm not going to take a side on it, but there is a reason that's the case. Okay. So let's talk about the Electoral College. Every single state, all 50 states, have an assigned number of electors that make up the Electoral College. That number is based on the total number of representatives in the House of Representatives plus the number of senators. So the minimum you could have if you have 2 senators and 1 House member is 3 electoral votes. So some states have just 3 electoral votes. So if you're quick on the math here, try to think how many electoral votes would Florida have. So you add the number of senators plus the number of members of the House. Okay. If you said 29 in your head, you're correct. We have 27 members in the House. We have 2 senators, so 29 electoral votes for Florida. That means there's a total of 538 delegates, 100 senators, 435 members of the House. There's a typo there, and 3 District of Columbia. They don't have representatives, but they do get to vote for president. So 3 electoral votes come from Washington D.C. That gets to 538. So to win the presidency, you have to have 270. That's the majority, right? So 270 is one more than half of 538. 48 states are winner take all. So if you win the popular vote in the states, you get all the electoral votes. So for example, Florida, we're what's called a swing state. We're basically 50-50. So let's say President Trump gets 51%, and let's say Joe Biden gets 49%. President Trump will get all 29 electoral votes added to his total if he wins Florida. Even though it's 50-50, he gets them all. 48 of the 50 states are that way. So once you add up all the votes, whoever gets 270 wins. Now, there is a scenario where somebody could not get 270. If a third-party candidate arises and maybe wins a couple states, the math could work out where neither candidate gets 270. In that case, listen carefully here. In that case, the House of Representatives actually has a vote, and they pick the president. Okay, so that's very rare. It's only happened a few times in our history. I want to say 2, maybe 3. 2 that I can think of. If that happens, the popular vote still doesn't pick the president. Now it's even less popular, less democratic. The 435 members of the House of Representatives, they vote and they pick who the president is if that happens. But again, almost every time in all our elections, someone's gotten the 270 because we are a two-party system. Okay, here's the electoral map for the United States. So here's Florida, 29 electoral votes. We're one of the biggest. Texas got 38, California got 55, New York got 29. Then you got all these states in the middle. All these states that have 3, they're the smaller states with a very little population. That means they only have 1 member of the House and they have 2 senators. Hawaii with 4, Alaska with 3. Okay. Now here's where I want to illustrate to you why the popular vote, in theory, again, I think there's flaws in this argument, but the popular vote in theory would not be a great representation of who actually likes the president. If it was just about popular vote, I want you to think in your head, where would you go to try to get votes? Literally, you'd go to 3 states, California, Texas, Florida, and would you even go, and maybe New York, and would you even go to every place in the state? Of course not. You'd go to the big cities, right? You'd go to Tampa, Orlando, Jacksonville. You'd go to Houston, Dallas, Fort Worth area, right? You'd go to LA. You'd go to Sacramento, San Francisco. You'd go to the big cities. You'd go to New York City, Manhattan, right? And if you could win a lot of the big cities, you could, in theory, win or get close to winning an entire election, popular vote, right? There'd be no reason to go to Montana. No one lives there. No reason to go to North Dakota, right? Now, to be fair, candidates still go basically to the big states. They still kind of ignore these little states because even though no one lives there and the popular vote isn't what picks you, they're also not worth a lot of points, a lot of electoral votes. So they still don't matter too much. But in theory, it's supposed to encourage a candidate to go to all 50 states to kind of get a cross section of representation, a cross section of votes, not just focus on only like 3 states and win those states or win a lot of the people in those states. The idea is you got to go everywhere, right? That was the strategy that kind of, I would say, doomed Hillary Clinton in 2016. She ignored what was called the blue wall, these states here, places like Wisconsin, Minnesota, Indiana, Illinois, Ohio, this area of the country, Pennsylvania, Minnesota. Typically, a lot of these states would go Democrat, would go blue, the color of the Democratic Party. And Hillary Clinton kind of ignored these states to some extent and focused on northeastern parts of the country, the West, tried to maybe flip some of these states in the South. Not that she didn't go here at all. She went everywhere, just like every candidate would. President Trump really focused on this and said, you know what, I know I'm going to lose California. I know I'm not going to do well in some of these western states or some of these northeast states. But if I can flip Wisconsin, if I can flip Minnesota, if I can flip Milwaukee, Illinois, Ohio, whatever, if I can flip them to red, yeah, maybe I'll lose a couple states over here, but I'm going to get 30, 40, 50 points that I wasn't expected to get, right? So that was kind of the strategy that worked for him. Now, he lost the popular vote because California, Florida was 50-50, basically. California, some other states went heavy against him. So that explains that. Now, again, one side says, yeah, but he still was 3 million's a lot of votes. In fact, Mitt Romney in 2012 was closer to Obama than Trump was to Hillary, and Mitt Romney got destroyed by Obama in the 2012 election. So you could say, hey, it's not really fair. Most people don't, according to votes, aren't a fan of the president, or at that point, the candidate. That's understandable too. So there's not one clear answer, but that's the idea of why this system exists. Okay. Also, I'll just mention this. Historically, in the 1800s, we know this, not everyone had the right to vote. Obviously, African Americans weren't even citizens yet. Women couldn't vote. If you were poor, you basically couldn't vote. Historically, our country doesn't like giving a lot of people the right to vote. Our founding fathers, early candidates in the 1700s and 1800s, didn't trust the average uneducated masses to make a good choice. So they wanted to make it tougher for the average Joe to just pick whoever. They wanted the smarter, more intellectual people to make the decisions. So that's kind of where that system even comes from. Now you could say, yeah, I like that, or you could say that's not fair. Both sides have merit. Okay, so that's the Electoral College. Guarantee you'll hear so much about the Electoral College when we get to 2020, the 2020 election. Okay. Let me just double check that my stream is still going here. All right, we're almost at an hour, but we're close to done. Let me just point out a couple things for you. We talked about powers and responsibilities granted to the executive branch. We talked about roles of the president. We talked a whole bunch about the succession process. We talked a whole bunch about why we have the Electoral College. So all we have left to talk about is the regulatory agencies that we just went over. If you look over here, we have actually talked about the 22nd Amendment, veto powers, appointment powers, presidential succession, the cabinet, those people that make up the presidential succession. All we have left is these 4 terms right here, which we will get to. They're part of those regulatory agencies, okay? All right, I'm going to skip these slides, not because they're not important. They're not on the vocab, they're on the objectives. You can kind of look at these in your own time. This is about how the candidates raise money. There's a lot of debate about this. It's worth your time to look over this if you have time. A big way that people raise money these days is what's called political action committees. You're going to see a lot of ads founded by political action committees in the next coming months. Okay. If you're bored or if you are interested about this, you can literally go to this website and you can read all about that. And I would really recommend watching this video. I'll probably post the video alone on Edsby for you to look at just so you have easier access to it. Okay. Again, we're skipping this. We're not worrying about that. We're not worrying about that. Okay, let's talk about the presidential cabinet because this is a vocab term and this is what's going to be on the test. The cabinet, again, is the president's most senior advisors. They are experts on specific subjects, so they advise the president on any subject that he may want advice about. They're appointed by the president. That's one of his powers. He can appoint positions, but they have to be confirmed by a Senate majority vote. There are right now 15 specific cabinet positions. They each have a specific role, and they make up positions 4 through 18 in the order of succession. So I'm going to go back to this list. The first 3 we already mentioned are not part of the cabinet. Secretary of State down are his cabinet. So the Secretary of State, they deal with international affairs. They deal with our country in relation to other countries. Secretary of Treasury deals with the Treasury. If you've been watching any of the press conferences recently with our president talking about coronavirus, our Secretary of Treasury has been up on the podium next to him like every single time because he's dealing with the money. He's dealing with how are we going to pay trillions of dollars to help all these people that are struggling during this time, right? Defense deals obviously with the military, so on and so forth, right? So that's his advisors. They're all experts on very specific things. There's my boss is the Secretary of Education. If you go all the way up to the top, she's in charge of education in this country, so on and so forth. Okay. All right. Let's talk about this. I don't have anything on the slide. I'm actually going to post additional assignments on Thursday that you're going to have to do for a grade about the regulatory agencies. Don't worry about it right now. That's going to help you complete the remaining 4 vocab terms and the remaining objective question. Okay, so I'm not going to talk about it. I just want to keep this video right under an hour. That's why it's helpful to watch the videos, by the way, because if you just go through the slides on your own, I'm not giving you this extra information. I'm not, you're going to see this blank slide and be like, I don't know what's this about, right? So I'm going to post an assignment, one more additional assignment that's going to be due for a grade. I'm going to post it on Thursday. It's going to be due next Monday. So I'll have that and the instructions and all that in just a couple of days, okay? All right, and that is it. We made it, okay? So let me just point out the terms. We covered it all. The only ones we did not cover is these 4 regulatory agencies. There's going to be an additional assignment I'm going to want you to do I'm going to post it on Edsby Thursday, so don't fret. And then question number 3, describe the various regulatory agencies. Again, by answering that assignment, doing that assignment, you'll be able to answer that question. Everything else we covered. That's the presidency in a nutshell. Now, again, I'm sad that we're not meeting in person because we had some fun assignments I had planned. I would love to go more in depth about the presidency, especially in an election year. Um, we're going to have the primaries going on right now. We're going to have the debates happening in the fall, and we're going to have either a president win a second election, or we're going to have a new president coming next November, right? It's exciting times. But unfortunately, I won't be with you for that, okay? All right. Let me just remind you one last time when stuff is due. I've now posted the PowerPoint already. That was yesterday, the vocab and the objectives. The YouTube live lecture is complete. The quiz opens a week from today, and I'll put when it closes. I'll actually do it right now. Closes 4/20, and additional I can't spell, assignment posted on 4/9, due 4/13. Okay. All right. So that is what's coming up. This is going to be on Edsby if you haven't already seen it. So that's our schedule for the week. Okay. All right. Hope everybody has a good night. It's 10 o'clock at night. I hope you're not staying up to 10 o'clock at night watching this. I hope you have other things to do with your time. You can watch this any old time. And again, you can feel free to pause, rewind, go to different parts, whatever works for you. I'm not expecting you to sit down and listen to the sound of my voice for an hour straight. I mean, you can, but yeah, that's up to you. All right. Miss you guys. Hope everyone's doing well. We will get back together virtually very soon. Bye bye.